They said Africa would never rise, but one man is proving them wrong.
They thought our silence meant submission, that our stillness was weakness, that the youth of Africa, loud online but quiet in the streets, had no strategy, no structure, no soul. But silence, my brothers and sisters, is not always surrender. Sometimes silence is the breath before the roar. Sometimes silence is not compliance. It is calculation. And what they misread as our absence was simply our awakening. You see, there comes a moment in the life of a people when speaking softly is no longer noble. It becomes dangerous. Not dangerous to us, but to those who profit from our sleep. And yet, for too long, we stayed quiet. Not because we were blind, but because we were watching. Not because we were afraid, but because we were waiting for clarity, for unity, for purpose. That time has come. The youth are no longer interested in empty slogans, no longer moved by ceremonial politics or televised promises. We have grown disillusioned not with hope, but with hypocrisy. We don't want another election. We want evolution, and we've learned, by observing history, by watching our parents' generation trade dreams for survival, that silence without strategy is just decay. But silence with vision, that becomes the storm. And make no mistake, this storm doesn't come with noise for its own sake. It comes with intention. It comes with precision. Because we understand now that true change doesn't begin on podiums. It begins in minds. It begins in the quiet rebellion of thought, in the dangerous act of thinking for oneself. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is what the colonial world fears. An African youth that thinks, not just reacts, but thinks, questions, designs, builds, because thinking leads to organizing, organizing leads to movement, and movement grounded in truth becomes revolution. That's the rhythm we're entering now. The silence wasn't the absence of movement, it was the tuning of instruments. And now, Africa's youth is ready to play its own symphony, with its own rhythm, in its own time, with its own hands. They underestimated us because they mistook our restraint for incapacity. They thought if we weren't shouting, we must be sleeping. But even seeds are silent before they split the earth. And what they failed to understand is this: the fire does not announce itself before it burns down the empire. So if you feel restless, good. If you feel angry, good. But do not waste that energy screaming into the void. Harness it, sharpen it, let it fuel you, not consume you. Because we are not the echo of their world, we are the authors of our own. This is not the silence of defeat. This is the silence before the storm, and the storm is ours to command. Africa was never poor. That sentence alone unsettles people. It shakes something at the foundation of what we've been told and what we've come to believe about ourselves. Because if Africa was never poor, then the entire narrative, the one that paints us as dependent, as needy, as perpetually catching up, is a lie. And if it's a lie, then who benefits from it? And more importantly, who pays the price? Let's be clear, Africa is not empty. It is overflowing, with resources, with brilliance, with history, with youth. From the gold beneath our soil to the cobalt in your smartphone, from the diamonds in luxury shops to the oil that powers global industry, Africa bleeds wealth. And yet, somehow, we've been made to feel ashamed. We've been told our story starts with lack, but it doesn't. It starts with abundance. It starts with empire. It starts with power, power that was stolen, not surrendered. You see, what they call today is a distraction, a diversion from the real theft. Because what is aid but a small return on what was looted? They extract our minerals, our labor, our minds, and then hand us pennies in return, dressed up as generosity. And we're expected to say thank you. But we're done saying thank you for crumbs. We are not beggars at the banquet of global wealth. We are its chefs, its farmers, its origin. This truth is especially important for the youth to understand. Because if you inherit a distorted story, you inherit a distorted identity. And if you believe you come from poverty, you act like you must be saved. But if you know you come from wealth, real, rooted, historical wealth, then you rise differently. You walk differently. You lead differently. Because you're no longer asking for permission to exist. You're claiming what is already yours. And let's not pretend this is just history. It's still happening. The pipelines, the trade deals, the interest rates, the so-called partnerships, they are dressed in new suits, but the intentions remain the same. Control, dependency, extraction. They want your future cheap, your labor obedient, your dreams manageable. But I ask you, can a continent as rich as ours afford to stay silent? Can we afford to be anything less than revolutionary in reclaiming what belongs to us? The world profits from the illusion of African poverty, but illusions only hold when people stop asking questions. And we, the youth, are asking, we're looking, we're remembering, and we're refusing to forget. Because we understand now that to be born on this soil is not a curse. It is a calling, a responsibility, a birthright. Africa was never poor. It was plundered. And now that we know the truth, silence is no longer an option. Ownership is. We are told to wait. Wait until we're older. Wait until we've proven ourselves. Wait until the world is ready to hear us. But here's the truth. The world will never be ready for an African youth that is awake, organized, and unafraid. And more importantly, we are no longer interested in waiting. Because every generation that was told to wait before us is now asking, what did we wait for? We waited through colonial rule. Then we waited through independence that looked like foreign control in new clothing. We waited through structural adjustment, through puppet regimes, through debt that we never asked for. And still today, we're told to wait, to be patient while the wealth of our lands is shipped out and the dreams of our people are locked away. No, that patience is over, not because we are reckless, but because we are ready. The youth are not tomorrow's leaders. We are today's revolutionaries. We are not some future potential. We are the living pulse of a continent in motion. We are the ones building digital businesses in cities with no stable electricity. We are the ones documenting truth when media lies. We are the ones turning grief into music, oppression into art, and resistance into structure. The storm is not on the horizon. It's already moving. And its energy is being carried on the backs of young people who no longer want a seat at the table. They want to break the table and rebuild it in their own image. This is what terrifies those who hold power today. They are not afraid of violence. They're afraid of clarity. They're afraid of African youth who understand history, question authority, and organize not around tribes or religions, but around purpose. Because when we move as one, not just as Nigerians or Congolese or Burkinab, but as Africans with a shared destiny, we become unstoppable. That's why we are distracted, divided, and discredited. Because unity powered by youth is a force no colonizer can contain. And let's be clear, this is not about rebellion for the sake of rebellion. This is about responsibility. Because if we, the youth, do not step up now, we will inherit not just the land, but the chains. Chains of debt, chains of broken education, chains of foreign dependency dressed up as policy, and we refuse to inherit failure politely. We will meet it loudly, with new ideas, new structures, and a new language of power. So to the youth listening, you are not lost. You are not too late. You are not too young. You are exactly on time. You are the answer your ancestors whispered about, the voice your country hoped for. The breath Africa has been holding. We are not waiting anymore. We are moving, and we are not asking for space. We are becoming the storm that creates it. They told us that education was the way out. That if we sat still, followed the rules, memorized their lessons, and passed their tests, we would one day be free. But free to do what? To manage systems we didn't build. To serve economies that were never designed for our dignity. To climb ladders that reach nowhere, but back into the arms of those who trained us to be silent in the first place. Let's be honest, much of what we call education in Africa today is not a tool of liberation. It is a continuation of colonial programming. We were taught to admire Europe, but forget Timbuktu. We were trained to speak foreign languages fluently, but remain mute in the language of our own liberation. We were graded not on our ability to think critically, but on our ability to repeat. And repetition without reflection is not learning, it's obedience. The goal was never to educate us into power. It was to civilize us into submission, to replace our sense of self with a sense of shame. And the system worked, for a time, because when you control how people learn, you shape what they believe is possible. You shrink their vision. You bend their dreams to fit within the fences you've built. And what we're now beginning to realize is that we were not undereducated, we were miseducated. But this generation, we're rewriting the curriculum. We are no longer interested in degrees that lead to dependence. We are choosing knowledge that builds freedom. We are unlearning what was designed to make us small and relearning what was buried to keep us from rising. Our classrooms are changing, from school halls to street corners, from textbooks to lived experience, from hierarchy to community. We are learning by doing, teaching by example, and creating new knowledge from the fire of our own lives. And this is where the power lies, because when youth begin to educate themselves, the empire begins to tremble. When we start asking, who decided this was truth? And who benefits from this version of history? That's when change begins. Not from rebellion alone, but from re-education. From reclaiming the narrative and deciding, finally, to be the authors of our own minds. This isn't about throwing away knowledge. It's about choosing which knowledge serves us and which knowledge enslaves us. It's about asking, not what we can memorize, but what we can create, what we can question, what we can dare to imagine outside the narrow corridors of colonial thought. Because an educated African youth who knows who they are, where they come from, and what they deserve, that is the greatest threat to the global status quo. They taught us to bow, but we learned to rise. And now, we will teach ourselves into a freedom no colonizer ever intended us to find. If you want to control a people, you don't just take their land, you fracture their identity. You convince them that they are not one, but many. That they are tribes first, citizens second, and Africans last. That their neighbor's language is foreign. That their brother's religion is dangerous. That their sister's culture is strange. This was the genius of colonial strategy, not just to conquer by force, but to divide by design. And so, long after the flags were lowered and the statues removed, the invisible lines remained. Lines drawn in Berlin, not in Bamako. Lines that turned kin into strangers and made borders out of bloodlines. But here's what's even more painful. We didn't just inherit those lines. We began to protect them. We began to believe in them. We began to die for them. That is the wound we must now confront. Because our disunity is not organic, it's engineered. And the youth must be the ones to say, no more. No more fighting each other while foreign corporations walk away with the wealth beneath our feet. No more tribal loyalty that blinds us to the bigger picture. No more recycled politics of separation masquerading as patriotism. Because the truth is, our struggles are not isolated. They are connected. The pain of a farmer in Niger echoes in the hunger of a family in Malawi. The silencing of a student in Sudan mirrors the oppression of a protester in Senegal. It is the same storm, touching different soil. And if the system has globalized its power, then we must globalize our unity. We must begin to see ourselves, not as fragments, but as a whole, not just as nations, but as a generation. Because unity is not the absence of difference. It is the refusal to let difference be used against us. It starts with language, with the willingness to learn from one another, even if our dialects differ. It starts with stories, with amplifying African voices across African platforms. It starts with action, with youth-led networks that don't stop at the border, with trade that serves people before profits, with alliances rooted not in old loyalties, but in shared liberation. Because when we are divided, we are manageable, profitable, but when we move as one, when we rise as one, We become the very thing they feared. We might become all along powerful beyond measure. Not because we have weapons, but because we have will. Not because we speak one language, but because we breathe one purpose. So no, I don't care where you come from. I care where you're going, and I care that we get there together. Because Africa doesn't need more borders. It needs more bridges. They divided us to rule us. Now we unite to free ourselves. One people, one pulse, one unstoppable movement. There's a shift that happens the day a people stop begging. It's subtle at first. You stop looking outward for answers. You stop measuring your value by foreign applause. You stop holding out your hands, and instead, you start using them to build, to plant, to protect. Because the moment you stop asking to be saved is the moment you realize no one is coming, and no one needs to. You were never broken. You were just lied to. We have been conditioned to see aid as help, as mercy, as kindness. But what if I told you that much of what we call aid is a leash? A calculated transaction wrapped in the language of generosity. Money comes in, yes, but so do conditions. Policies we didn't write, projects we didn't choose, dependencies we didn't ask for. And slowly, we begin to forget how to walk on our own. The truth is, aid is not free. It comes at the cost of sovereignty. It reshapes our priorities. It distorts our economies. It kills our industries before they are born. We import what we could grow. We borrow for what we could build. And all the while, we are told we cannot survive without help, without their funds, their consultants, their permission. But ask yourself, if aid was truly designed to lift us up, why are we still on our knees? The youth must be the ones to see through this illusion. Because if you inherit a system built on dependence, you risk becoming loyal to it. You start thinking small. You start settling for survival instead of demanding transformation. But we didn't come here to survive. We came to rewrite the story. And that means refusing to be pitied, refusing to be managed, refusing to be seen as problems waiting to be fixed. We don't need handouts. We need fair trade. We need access to our own resources. We need infrastructure designed for people, not profit. And most of all, we need leadership that answers to its people, not to foreign interests. That's why when a young African stands up and says, "We will do it ourselves," the world calls him dangerous. Because independence is always a threat to those who benefit from control. But let's be clear, this is not about isolation. It's about balance. It's about partnership with dignity, about trade with respect, about cooperation without compromise. And that only begins when we know our worth, not just in numbers, but in vision, in legacy, in spirit. So to the youth of Africa, do not wait for permission to take what is yours. Your mind is yours. Your future is yours. Your continent is yours. The help you need is already within you. The day we stopped begging was the day we became free. And now that we've stood up, we will never kneel again. We've been told that the youth are wild, that we are impulsive, undisciplined, distracted, that we are addicted to noise and incapable of leading with reason. But these are not reflections of who we are. They are projections of what those in power fear. Because when they look at us, they don't just see restlessness. They see potential. They see energy they can't predict, fire they can't control. And that's terrifying to a system built on predictability. But what they overlook, what they refuse to see, is that we are not chaotic. We are not lost. We are organizing, quietly, strategically, and with a clarity that comes not from textbooks, but from lived experience. We are tired of waiting for armies to protect us, for governments to serve us, for institutions to save us. So we are becoming what we've been denied. We are becoming the army. Not an army of violence, but an army of vision. Not one that breaks things down, but one that builds from the ground up, armed not with weapons, but with courage, with skill, with information, with a deep, fierce loyalty to justice. This is what makes us dangerous. Not because we seek destruction, but because we are unafraid of transformation. We understand that change doesn't come from rage alone. It comes from structure, from discipline, from preparation, from showing up again and again, even when it's hard, even when it's lonely, even when no one claps. The youth of today are learning this. We are becoming precise with our time, intentional with our energy, ruthless with our standards, because we know we are not just fighting a system. We are building something to replace it. And that requires more than fire. It requires form. This is how the revolution sustains itself. Not just in the noise of protest, but in the silence of planning. In the hours spent studying, coding, farming, organizing, healing. In the ways we protect one another when the cameras are off. In the decisions we make every day, to live with integrity, to lead with principle, to dream beyond the limits we've been handed. So no, we are not undisciplined. We are training every day in resilience, in truth, in purpose. And we are doing so in the face of ridicule, censorship, and doubt, because we know what is at stake. And we are not willing to hand the next generation another cycle of suffering dressed up as stability. The youth are not the problem. We are the solution that was never supposed to exist. And now that we do, the world will have to adjust. We are the new army of Africa, not built on fear, but forged in purpose. We don't destroy for attention. We build for a future they never imagined we'd fight for. The West doesn't fear our poverty. It relies on it. It doesn't fear our instability. It benefits from it. What it truly fears is something far more dangerous. It fears an African continent that is awake, conscious, united, led not by puppets but by principles, not by dependence but by dignity. And especially, it fears an African youth that no longer wants to imitate but innovate, that no longer asks but acts. Because when we begin to define our own success, we stop chasing their approval. When we speak in our own voice, we no longer echo their scripts. And when we choose unity over division, clarity over confusion, action over applause, we become something they cannot control. We become unpredictable. And for those who've built their power on our passivity, nothing is more terrifying than an Africa that no longer plays along. Let's be honest. For decades, we've been told we are progressing, modernizing, developing. But who defines development? Who benefits from the version we're being sold? Skyscrapers rising next to slums, youth unemployed while contracts go to foreign firms. Resources extracted, but communities left in darkness. We're not rejecting progress. We're rejecting the lie that this is the only way forward. What they fear is not a violent uprising. What they fear is a cultural uprising, a psychological revolution, a mass awakening where African people, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, begin to see through the illusion, begin to question the polished narratives, begin to realize that the world they were taught to admire is built, in part, on the suppression of their own. When we start valuing our knowledge systems, when we teach our children to be proud of who they are, not ashamed, when our art, our music, our tech, our agriculture, our governance, all begin to reflect us, not a mimicry of someone else, that is when the balance of power shifts, and that shift is already happening. Slowly, quietly, relentlessly. This is why independent thinkers are silenced, why strong voices are labeled as threats. Because once the youth stop asking for permission, the empire begins to tremble. Because empires don't fall from explosions. They fall from awakening, from erosion of fear, from the rising confidence of a people who finally know their worth. And that's exactly where we are. The youth are no longer intimidated by the glare of the West. We're not waiting to be invited to the table. We are building our own, with our hands, with our stories, with our truth. So let them fear us, let them worry. Not because we carry hate, but because we carry history, and hope, and healing, the kind they never expected to survive the centuries of oppression. But it has, and it's rising now. They don't fear our silence. They fear the moment we start speaking in our own voice. And that moment has arrived. Let's talk about this illusion of peace, the kind that keeps you quiet, obedient, and disconnected. The kind of peace that isn't really peace at all. It's compliance dressed in civility. It's the silence we're forced into when we're told not to make noise, not to challenge the systems that bind us, not to disturb the calm of the status quo. But let me ask you, who does this peace serve? Because if the price of peace is your dignity, your potential, your future, then it's not peace. It's captivity. You see, for generations, colonial powers and their loyal successors, the elites who inherited the script, have taught us that order must be preserved at all costs, that we should avoid conflict, settle down, lower our voices, be reasonable. And somewhere along the way, we started believing that being good citizens meant being passive participants in our own oppression. We stopped asking questions. We stopped demanding truth. We mistook survival for freedom. But the youth, you are the storm that exposes this lie. Because your hunger, your restlessness, your refusal to accept the world as it is, that is not a weakness. That is the compass of history trying to turn north again. What you feel, this deep discomfort with inequality, with the fake peace of smiling politicians and empty reforms, is not a mistake. It is the beginning of clarity. And clarity is dangerous to systems built on confusion and obedience. That's why they call you radical. That's why they tell you to calm down. Because if you ever truly wake up, if you ever truly organize, this entire illusion comes crashing down. So no, we do not want your version of peace if it means silencing our voices, numbing our hearts, or lowering our gaze. Our ancestors did not bleed so we could be polite. They fought so we could be free. And freedom, real freedom, is not always calm. Sometimes it looks like noise, like protest, like defiance, like creating art that unsettles, music that stirs, and movements that refuse to fit inside the lines drawn by colonial rulers. This is not about chaos for the sake of chaos. It's about rising together, with vision, with strategy, with love for our people and fury for their pain. Because the storm we bring is not to destroy our homes, it's to reclaim them. So I ask you, with everything you carry, with everything you've survived, don't shrink for their comfort. Don't trade your fire for their silence. If their peace demands your silence, then it was never peace to begin with. Let them call it noise. Let them call it rebellion. But we will call it the beginning of truth. And truth, once spoken, never dies. What we often call healing, in the context of African relationships, personal, political, or cultural, is not just about reconciliation. It's about reclamation. Reclaiming stories, reclaiming dignity, reclaiming the language of our emotions and the architecture of our families. The scars that colonialism left behind were not only physical, not only territorial. They were relational. They disrupted the sacred rhythm of intimacy between generations, between partners, between communities. And we cannot talk about a future for Africa. One vision, one Africa, one future, if we are not willing to face the reality that colonization trained us to mistrust each other, to devalue our own, to fear closeness as a form of vulnerability rather than strength. Let's talk honestly about the ways division was engineered. The family unit was intentionally dismantled, loyalty was rerouted from tribe to empire, and affection became conditional on survival. We learned to shut down emotionally to protect ourselves from further rupture. We stopped talking. We stopped feeling. We turned our silence inward, and our intimacy became a casualty of survival. But survival is no longer our ceiling. We must now dare to thrive, and thriving begins with rebuilding the bridges between us. What does that look like? It means we must return to each other. We must return to the wisdom of the elders who understood that love is not a Western invention, that intimacy is not weakness, that to know another deeply and to let yourself be known is a revolutionary act in a world that trains you to hide. We must teach our young men that strength is not measured by control or withdrawal, but by presence. That showing up emotionally, fully, honestly, is not feminine, it is human. And we must teach our young women that their voice is not a threat, it is an anchor. That softness and power are not opposites. Healing our relationships is political work. It is anti-colonial work, because the colonizer never wanted Africans to look each other in the eyes and say, I see you, I feel you, I stand with you, because intimacy builds solidarity, and solidarity is the enemy of oppression. But the youth, this generation, you are different. You are not afraid to speak. You are not afraid to feel. You are not afraid to demand relationships rooted in equality, reciprocity, and emotional truth. You are not afraid to challenge silence where it has become a prison. That is where the storm begins. Not with rage, but with radical reconnection. That is where power is born, not from domination, but from the courage to feel again, to love again, to trust again. This is our future, not built on mimicry of the systems that broke us, but on the emotional blueprints we carry deep in our bones. We don't need imported definitions of love, power, or success. We need to remember who we were before we were told who we had to be. Because when an African heart heals, a nation rises. And when we love without fear, we become unstoppable.